So, good afternoon, everyone. While people are coming in, I can perhaps introduce already the meeting. So, in the context of the current budgetary control in Belgium, many people are pointing out the importance of taking impactful measures on public finance deficit. The social partners in the Central Economic Council have already expressed their views on this in a report published in January of this year that is also available on our website. And regularly, the Central Economic Council organizes now the debate on public finance in the form of webinars. All webinars that we have organized are also still available on a platform that is dedicated on all what we do about public finance. Today's presentation will also be made available on the platform. The climate transition is gaining importance. Sufficient investments must be made to make the economy net zero as soon as possible. Unfortunately, people, the environment and the economy are already feeling more and more negative effects and also the costs due to the consequences of the global warming. However, the effects are very complex and characterized by a great deal of uncertainty, which may also explain why there is very little research that has been done on this subject so far. The Central Economic Council takes on the challenge of gaining some insights into the impact of the ongoing climate transitions on the public finances. The Central Economic Council will organize different seminars to allow various experts on different themes to analyze some of the impacts of climate change on public finance. So there are more webinars that will follow this one. Today is the very first webinar on this item, and a study will be presented that attempts to calculate the costs for public finances of the increases in extreme weather phenomena as a result of global warming. This study that was carried out by the European Commission, and we thank them to be one of the first that have dared to open the discussion on this very difficult subject. And we are very grateful that two of the authors of the study are willing to present today the results of their research to us. So Nicola Gagliardi and Stéphanie Pamies. I think, Stéphanie, you will take first the floor. It's to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. So very happy to be here, and thanks a lot for the invitation. So indeed, I will say a few words of introduction, maybe first to introduce myself. So I'm Stéphanie Pamies. I work in DG ECFIN, heading the unit in charge of assessing the sustainability of public finances. And indeed, for us, it's a new area of development. We've started to introduce this topic only recently in our analysis. So just to introduce a bit and to put this work into context. So what is clear is that over the past decades, past years, so the world and the EU economy has experienced several unprecedented shocks. So we've had succession of really unexpected developments to some extent. So we've had, of course, the global financial crisis, then we have the COVID-19 pandemic, now an energy crisis and renewed fears related to the banking sector. And these have created huge challenges on the economy and also on public finances. So we are in a situation where public debt across the world, but in particular in the EU economy, has reached very high levels. While at the same time, we have all these structural trends, these fiscal headwinds that are still present and intensifying. And of course, climate change is one of them. So far, in terms of the Commission work, we had mostly focused in terms of this long-term trend on population aging. So it's something on which we've worked now for many years together with the member states. While climate change, as I said, is something we've started to look into only over the last 3 years, I would say. And the two phenomena, they share some common features because they share the common feature to create multiple challenges with economic and fiscal repercussions. However, the degree of uncertainty seems particularly high when it comes to climate change, and really when it comes to attempting to quantify the economic and fiscal impact of climate change and climate change policies. It's not a coincidence that this work is still new in this area, because truly it is a challenge, as also Nicola will show today. So despite these being challenges, we think it's extremely important to try to progress in this direction, and that's why we've taken different steps to have an idea and to best inform policy makers about it, create the right incentives at a time when clearly this phenomenon is accelerating and is showing more and more impacts on our daily lives, I would say. So I'll stop here. I'll pass the floor to Nicola, and I hope this first study that we've done indeed will be set, let's say, a precedent, and will allow to have more studies and more exchanges on the topic. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stéphanie. Just also let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Nicola Gagliardi, and again, thanks all for inviting us. I'm an economist in DG ECFIN, and I work indeed in the Sustainability of Public Finances unit, which is headed by Stéphanie. So just to set up a bit the context, today we will be mainly discussing both from a theoretical and also an empirical perspective the interlinkages between climate change and debt sustainability. Now, let me first start with some key facts, which are certainly well known to most of us attending the seminar today, but it's always good refreshing. So we know that climate change is a very complex global phenomenon. It's a very serious threat that is already affecting an entire ecosystem that has the potential to affect even more our society, especially the most vulnerable, as well as many different aspects of people's lives, including our economy. And yet, when it comes, as already it has been said, to performing climate risk assessment, well, especially the economic assessments of climate change, well, this is very challenging because on certain aspects, climate science is itself surrounded by large uncertainty, specifically in terms of how frequent and how intense, for instance, extreme weather events will be exactly in the future. And of course, these large uncertainties translated into our economic assessments. At the same time, why is it so difficult to study the impacts of climate change? Well, because it is a very long-term horizon challenge. We know that the very cumulative, catastrophic impacts of climate change will be mostly felt beyond the traditional horizon that the policymakers or market participants usually face. But we know that to try and avoid these catastrophic impacts, some of them are already quite irreversible and already visible today. Action is very much needed today. Now, also, we know that it's very unequivocal that human activities through the emission of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have already warmed our planet above 1.1 degrees Celsius over the last 9 years only compared to pre-industrial levels. And of course, this has been having quite some physical consequences. On the one hand, we could think of more gradual transformation of the environment, so melting ice sheets, for instance, which has been occurring quite a lot, but also more intense and more frequent extreme weather events. The year 2022 has been exemplary in this respect in terms of the extensive heat waves or droughts and wildfire that we've really witnessed across the world. And yet there is always the risk that there might be potential non-linearities or the crossing of the so-called tipping points. So things that at one point may increase the likelihood of catastrophic outcomes to occur and that are extremely unpredictable. And Probably some of you may have seen the IPCC published a very recent report only 2 days ago, and they once again confirmed that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. So really, action is very much needed in the short term in terms of strong climate mitigation. Now, I would also like to give some key facts about the EU. What has been so far happening in terms of extreme weather events in the EU? On the left-hand side, we see that our continent has been characterized by a numerous amount of extreme weather events, notably meteorological and hydrological ones. And when we go and decompose such events, almost 70% represent either storms or floods. Now, as you can see, it's not easy to identify a clear trend because the extreme events have been more numerous in some years than others. But yet, what we know is that the intensity and the frequency of these events is already starting to increase, and according to recent scientific studies, is expected to increase even more. And these impacts have also not been evenly distributed, let's say, across the EU, but on the contrary, in this graph, once again, on the left-hand side, we see that there have been some countries relatively more hit than others. And yet, if you look at the dark blue bar, which shows the let's say the extent of the extreme weather events over the last 20 years only, rather than the last 40, you see that over 2020, the extent of these events have been increasing really across the board. Now, Central, Eastern European countries, also as you can see in our small heat map here, have been particularly hit. And yet, as you can also see, there is really no country in the EU that has been spared by the increase in extreme events. Now, why is this relevant also for us? Because, of course, there are economic and fiscal repercussions of climate change. And the literature usually distinguishes two sources of risks with economic and fiscal consequences of climate change. On the one hand, we have the so-called physical risks. On the other hand, we have the transition risks. Now, the physical risks are themselves distinguished into chronic and acute. And from an economic perspective, the chronic physical risks, such as the issue of sea level rise, for instance, or similar biodiversity loss, they may cause permanent damage to our economy also over the medium and long term, since they reflect a more gradual and mostly irreversible transformation of the environment due to global warming. Whereas acute physical risks, or the extreme weather events, which are, as they're mostly commonly known, well, they tend to cause an immediate economic damage, but they may also lead to potential short to medium-term consequences. Instead, by transition risks, we refer to those risks that are related to the mitigation policy efforts, notably from the transition to a low-carbon economy, which, as we will see, might also have macroeconomic and fiscal implications. Now, while we are tackling the two from a conceptual perspective, in a sense, in a separate way, it's important to stress that physical and transition risks are not independent of each other, but they tend to interact because, of course, if we have inadequate mitigation policy action, then of course this can aggravate physical risks, and in turn, this will intensify even further transition risks. So, whereas from a conceptual point of view, it's necessary in a sense to split them, it's always important to remember that these two things are really strictly intertwined. Let's first start from the physical risks. Now, how can physical risks impact our economy? Well, they may most notably impact it via unforeseen shocks through the main growth drivers. So very simply, supply and demand. Let's think of an extreme weather event that may affect the capital stock or disrupt capital stock infrastructure, for instance, or also have an impact on food and input shortages, or impacts on labor supply, impacts on labor productivity. From the demand side, the environment of uncertainty, sometimes that is also caused by extreme events, may generate shifts in consumption and investment patterns, but also have an impact on trade flows. Of course, we live in an interconnected economy. If a specific country, which is our trade partner, is affected, then of course, this might imply lower exports, lower imports, disruption of global value chains. So while certainly the most adverse impacts of climate change, also from an economic perspective, are expected to be felt by those people with the highest exposure to such disasters, and especially those with the lowest capacity to prepare for such events or to cope with such events, it's always important to remember that, once again, via global market interactions, the impacts may spill over also to less exposed, sometimes the advanced economies, for instance. Now, in terms of timing of the economic impact, as I was already mentioning, the literature seems to agree on the fact that in the very short term, physical risks, especially extreme weather events, tend to cause an immediate economic damage. However, this damage may also last over the medium term, depending, however, on the country's specificities. And one of the most important specificities, as the literature has shown, is of course the extent to which the economic losses are insured, because the inadequate insurance coverage of economic losses from disasters are the main driver behind the adverse macroeconomic impacts. Whereas the empirical literature is in agreement on the fact that sufficiently insured losses tend to be almost inconsequential in terms of foregone output. Now, looking at what's been happening in the EU so far in terms of economic impacts of physical risks, well, we have to say that, first of all, the impact has been quite heterogeneous and also on average quite limited so far. Most of the economic impacts have been driven by flood and storm events, and the impact, of course, has been different over time and across countries. In particular, however, it's interesting to notice that a large share, actually more than 60% of the total reported economic losses in the EU has been caused by a small number, so really just less than 3% of the uniquely registered events. This is because when extreme events happen, of course, they struck really hard. And while, as I was saying so far, the historical information tells us that in the EU, we've been relatively less exposed compared to other countries. It's also interesting to notice that such impacts may suffer from significant underestimation and underreporting, because economic impacts are usually extracted from global natural disaster databases. Now, these databases suffer from several limitations sometimes, because they're not always publicly available. The reporting of economic losses, for instance, is not necessarily done systematically. And also, with a more forward-looking approach, in a sense, as I was saying, we know that the scientific literature has this consensus that there will be more frequent and more intense extreme weather events in the future. Consequently, we also expect that economic losses may be already 2 to 3 times higher in the EU only by 2050. And by the end of the century, again, unless adequate mitigation and adaptation action is implemented, these losses may increase even further in a more non-linear impact. Now, in this slide, I'm actually showing and summarizing what I was saying before. If you look on the left-hand side, we have the last column shows the total economic losses over the last 40 years as percentage of GDP across the EU. And what we can see, I've introduced some circles just to give some examples, but you can see that in most of the cases, one specific storm event, one specific flood event in one specific year has caused half the majority, if not even the totality, of the registered economic losses in the EU. And on the left-hand side, we see also this more forward-looking perspective. I'm showing several regional aggregates based on the Peseta 4 project of the JRC. And what this shows is that compared to today's baseline climate condition, again, unless adequate mitigation and adaptation action is introduced, in a 1.5-degree warming scenarios at the EU level, losses may already increase by a factor 2. And in a 2-degree warming scenario, already by a factor 2.5. But once again, if we were to look already at a bit later in the century, these multiplication factors, in a sense, these factor increases, would be much, much higher, and certainly less non-linear, less linear, sorry. So now, what about the fiscal impact of physical risks? Well, public finances may be affected both directly and indirectly. Here we report only some instances, of course. We may think of potential pressures on public spending. Once again, we might have to spend more and so increase public debt to replace damaged infrastructure, but also to pay out social transfers or subsidies for the most affected groups of our society. But also investments in adaptation policies, of course, might be required, requiring therefore more public spending. Other instances include tax revenue losses. Let's think, for instance, of an extreme weather event disrupting economic activities. Of course, this would imply that we're not collecting tax revenues from those specific affected sectors, but which on the contrary might have to be helped. We might also think of the potential materialization of both explicit and implicit contingent liabilities. This may be the case of government guarantees, public-private partnerships, but also potential public support to the banking and insurance sectors in case the state might be at one point required to act as lender of last resort. And also an impact on sovereign financing costs, because, of course, when extreme events occur and if they start occurring more frequently, then, of course, this creates a huge environment of uncertainty, which itself translates, of course, in financial markets uncertainty, and financial market reaction might be triggered, therefore increasing the sovereign financing costs for one country. All these aspects, therefore, have the potential to impact debt sustainability and the consequent sovereign capacity to repay debt over the medium term. Now, moving on to the transition risks, as we were saying, these refer to the related mitigation options that we have, but that we need desperately to stabilize climate and to limit such physical risks. Now, as we're all very well aware, more than 140 countries around the world, representing almost 90% of greenhouse gas emissions, have pledged or announced net zero targets by mid-century, by 2050 in most of the cases. And however, it's important to say also that the transition to the decarbonized economy is also expected to have several macroeconomic implications. Why? Well, because certainly we need to revise entirely our energy sector, because the energy sector accounts for around 75% of greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. But we also need improvements in energy efficiency, as well as in the way in which our agricultural sector, so land use changes, and forestry, the so-called LULUCF, are tackled. Of course, this in turn is going to imply what? Numerous technological, behavioral, and policy changes. Now, from an economic perspective, the conventional argument about transition risks is that they imply a trade-off between the reduction of the current emissions, which comes at a direct mitigation cost, and long-term environmental quality. Because we know that even if reducing current emission indeed has somewhat a cost in the short term, the benefits in the long run in terms of the so-called co-benefits from climate mitigation, and which entail improved health, say from lower air pollution, but also less frequent, less intense extreme weather events. Of course, these are of great benefits, and society itself will achieve a higher welfare in the long run. Now, what about the expected economic impacts of the transition? Well, climate mitigation is certainly expected to have the so-called green growth effects. So it is expected to spur investments in numerous green technologies, in green infrastructure. And of course, this will help boost aggregate demand, job creation, help firms, especially with lower production costs, and consequently boost economic growth. So there's really a virtuous circle that is created. At the same time, however, it's important to acknowledge how the transition may itself lead to some necessary asymmetrical impact and adjustment costs, particularly at the sectoral level, really in terms of distributional effects. And this is mostly due to changes in demand, capital allocation, and labor market changes, notably in the so-called brown sector, the more energy-intensive sectors, the more carbon-intensive sectors. And from a public finance perspective, of course, relatedly, they are also expected to be subject to several challenges from transition risks, although climate mitigation policies are actually expected to exert mixed pressures on public spending and revenues. And a priori, it is not easy to determine exactly what the impact will be, because the way the transition is managed is actually going to be the crucial thing, because everything will depend on the timing, the design, and the implementation of our policies, because credible mitigation policies, of course, already implemented as of today, they certainly have the potential to lower the potential macroeconomic implications. Now, let's also provide some instances in this case. So in terms of public spending, the transition to a decarbonized economy might entail higher public spending to replace and renovate, let's say, imagine capital stock, our infrastructure, our energy system, our transport systems. But also, once again, subsidies or transfers might be needed to support the transition of the most affected groups or specific regions that rely heavily on carbon-intensive sectors. And relatedly, but this I mentioned it already before, higher public spending also for adaptation policies, which again strictly is related to transition. And as far as revenues instead are concerned, we're all very well aware that fiscal policy is an amazing and an effective tool. It's been proven to tackle climate mitigation, notably by the introduction of carbon pricing. Carbon pricing can be done explicitly via carbon taxes, implicitly via regulation, but in general, carbon pricing, such as the EU ETS, for instance, well, these are likely to generate significant revenues, which will potentially allow us to remove other distortionary taxes. Let's think of capital or labor taxes, and therefore boost efficiency and growth. This is the so-called double dividend. However, one word of caution, because of course, it's equally important to stress how in the long term, we will need also additional revenue sources to complement, to top up the existing ones, especially because as the decarbonization is successfully phased in, of course, we will need to find alternative revenue sources as we shift away from the revenue sources which are more linked to fossil fuel related activities. And therefore, a strategic and timely use of such revenues and how these revenues are combined and are used, it will be key to avoid potential deteriorations of countries' fiscal position. Now, how do we include climate change into a macro-fiscal framework to assess its impacts? Well, first, let me say that as climate-related risks have often been absent, at least until recent years, from fiscal sustainability frameworks of official international institutions, because as we've already seen, this is really many complex channels that need to be taken into account. Sometimes they're not really easy to conceptualize and even quantify. So there have been over time several tentative modules, and at the EU level, what the Commission has been doing, its very first step was to introduce, in terms of climate change risks and debt sustainability, to introduce a conceptual framework in the 2019 Debt Sustainability Monitor, which is one of the flagship report of the European Commission. And this work has been implemented in the context of the new EU strategy on adaptation to climate change, which you may be aware of. But just to recap, the adaptation strategy alongside other actions such as the European Green Deal. They're all meant to really collocate the EU as a leader in the fight against climate change. This strategy has been approved and promoted in February 2021, and it has four main objectives. The main objective of the adaptation strategy is to make the EU a climate resilient society by 2050 and try to be fully adapted to the effects of climate change. And among the several objectives, the one that we're following to integrate, in a sense, our work is the more systemic adaptation, because according to this objective, the Commission is trying to integrate also adaptation into macro-fiscal policy. And in particular, the Commission has committed to develop ways to measure the potential impact of climate-related risks on public finances and also develop model, as we will see today, for climate stress testing, and all in a context of exploring and discussing with member states to try to dampen the fiscal impact of climate-related risks and try to reduce potential fiscal sustainability risks. So what have we been doing so far at the Commission in this framework is to adopt a step-by-step approach. As I was saying, we started with the 2019 Debt Sustainability Monitor with very conceptual consideration on how to try and encompass climate consideration into our debt sustainability analysis. But then with the Fiscal Sustainability Report 2021 and the related discussion paper that we are presenting today, we've made an additional step forward and shown first stylized stress tests on the fiscal impact of extreme weather events in the EU. However, of course, the work is still ongoing, because going forward, what we're working on right now is to tentatively construct also climate policy scenarios via, once again, stylized analysis to take into account also mitigation policy and adaptation policy options and their potential impact on their sustainability. And here I also include additional work that DG ECFIN has been performing in terms of climate change and public finances in terms of whatever concerns concepts and evidence in terms of disaster risk financing. Now, let's move on to the core of the analysis. What we've done in our paper, we started from, first of all, the acknowledgement that there is very limited evidence on the fiscal impact of extreme weather events for advanced economies. And so what we try to do is, again, provide stylized stress tests with a medium-term perspective, covering a time span of 10 years from today. And this is in line with the horizon that we use within the standard European Commission debt sustainability analysis. Now, our aim in the study was really to capture risks that were associated with a one-off shock from extreme events, and interpreting this shock as an aggravating factor to debt sustainability. In order to do so, we've relied on past exposure to extreme events, but also to future exposure and vulnerability to extreme events. And to do so, we adopt, therefore, a novel comparative approach. And just to give an intuition, what we try to do is that we try to look in a given country, what is the deviation from the Commission baseline debt to GDP projections that are commonly published in our reports, should a past extreme event reoccur in the medium term, and also calibrating this impact according to different global warming pathways. And we notably construct two scenarios, a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree scenario. Why? Because, of course, we know that for each additional degree of warming, or even half a degree of warming, there will be more frequent and more intense extreme events and related economic losses. And this somehow has to be taken into account. So in practice, what do? As we rely on the one hand on historical information from a global natural disaster database, and we complement this historical information with future expected losses, as I was saying, from potentially more intense and more frequent extreme events. And to do so, we look at two warming scenarios, a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree, which are compared to our baseline. And we assume both a direct impact on government accounts, this is done by an impact on the primary balance, But we also assume an indirect impact via GDP growth and level effects, so to also take into account potential denominator effects. And what very shortly what we find is that we find non-negligible impact of extreme events on public debt and debt sustainability in some countries. However, we also see that so far we tend to find manageable impact under the standard Paris Agreement scenario, so the 1.5 and the 2 degree. However, here as well, there is a caveat, because as I was saying already at the beginning, we rely, of course, on information on economic losses related to disasters. But as I was saying, these losses themselves suffer or may suffer, of course, from also quite a significant underestimation. Consequently, the related fiscal impact that we're estimating itself represents only a lower bound, because once again, there is potential uncertainty around the more frequent and more intense events that might occur, potential non-linearities and tipping points that are very hard to predict, let alone being inserted into a model, as well as potential cross-country spillovers or feedback effects. Now, in this slide, I'm basically summarizing our results. What I show here is the debt to GDP difference measured in percentage points of the two warming scenarios compared to our baseline. And these difference is only shown for the last year of the projections. Our projections go until 2032. And the countries that you see here, as you can see, is only a subset, of course, of EU countries, because we had to employ specific selection criteria to determine which countries were the most exposed in the past, but also which countries are going to be the most exposed and the most vulnerable in the future. What we can see, however, is that the blue line, the blue bar, represents the 1.5 degree scenario. The yellow one represents the 2 degree. What you can see is that across the board, countries are more or less hit. Some countries certainly more than others. But once again, these impacts are to be interpreted only as a lower bound, and what we can show is that extreme events have the potential, therefore, to have debt sustainability risks and impacts for many countries, especially for those countries that are already facing significant debt sustainability challenges without taking into account the potential aspects of climate change. So summing up, what we can conclude is that measuring fiscal risk from climate change is certainly a very critical, although quite challenging issue. And just to recall, the main limitations is that these range for the main challenges. Well, these range from modeling limitations, but also the current data availability, because the global natural disaster data are not always publicly available, and when they're available, they may suffer from underreporting. Sometimes there is also an issue of disaggregation of public versus private impacts, or also how to measure current versus expected vulnerability to climate change. So what we find is that in the EU, the fiscal impact from extreme events, as I was saying, tends to be non-negligible, but so far manageable under standard global warming pathways, as long as we remember that this is nonetheless a lower bound impact. And then therefore, extreme events have the potential to challenge our fiscal sustainability. So what do we conclude is that we need large-scale, rapid and immediate mitigation and adaptation measures to counteract and to minimize such effects as much as possible. Also taking into account the fact that climate transition itself is likely to pose further challenges on public finances. And as I was saying, this is something onto which further analysis are needed and onto which the Commission is currently working. And I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Voilà, I think I can give now the floor to the people attending the meeting. Are there some questions? You can put on the camera and the microphone. Yeah, Renat Hansens.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, which was very interesting. With the background of the recent report of the in French GIEC, IPCC, it would be interesting to execute also some scenarios with extremer paths, because we're on track on a warming up of 3.2% if measures are which should be taken are not taken. Just as an alarming signal, because the results would be more impactful, everybody can foresee. So, and as it's quite realistic that we will end up largely above 2%, because you will see the change that has to be taken, and the change is not being taken. That is what everybody sees. So do you foresee such other more extreme warming up scenarios to be analyzed and calculating physical impacts and so
on? Do you want me to, you want first collect questions, or should I reply one by one? You tell me how you prefer.
You can do one by one, yes.
Okay. No, thanks. That's a very interesting question. Indeed, I mean, a few days ago, the IPCC published this report. I mean, it's I think it's extremely interesting, encompassing, I think, all the scientific literature that we've had on the topic and the evidence, and it's really showing that, again, the window of opportunities it's closing. So what we did in our study was to only look at the 1.5 and the 2 degree scenario, because as I was saying, the depth sustainability analysis of the Commission is usually run for the medium term until 2030, 2032. So of course the horizon shifts depending on the starting point each time. Taking into account a higher warming scenario, would have not been for the moment too realistic for, in a sense, 2032, because certainly there is scientific evidence that by already mid-2030s, as you were saying, unless we really act seriously on the topic, we will overcome 1.5 and get very close to 2. So we thought that was very realistic, at least with the horizon that we were taken into account. However, should we certainly decide at one point to extend the analysis, although, you know, when it comes to, of course, the DSA extending the horizon, of course, comes with also uncertainty in a sense on other variables, in a sense on assumptions on other variables. So, but it's certainly something to be taken into account. But for the moment, we're also working on the transition part, and our very long-term project is certainly to have a very encompassing framework at one point to really under the same umbrella look at both physical and transition risks at the same time. I don't know if Stéphanie wants to complement.
Yeah, maybe a couple of things. I think, I mean, at the time when this work was done, it was seen as the standard scenarios in terms of global warming. So I think this is also why, I mean, we calibrated the scenario based on this, on what was foreseen at the time as most likely scenarios. But I think I share your view that if we have now more compelling evidence that things are accelerating and that such a more adverse scenario and in terms of increase of temperature could materialize a bit faster, this is something we could indeed consider. I think one issue, as Nicola stressed very well, is that we were actually a bit struck when we did this work about the difficulty to access high quality data when it comes to physical risks. So this is something also, I mean, I think we will be able to progress on the quantification also when we can have more data, better data on this phenomenon. So.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Stefan?
Yes, hello. So I was wondering, so you focused in the study mostly on the non-insured costs of global warming, but which would be, I guess, one of the reasons why Belgium was relatively low. But we can expect that with in the future, the insurance premium will become higher. So I'm wondering, to what have you taken into account the degree in which this might lower growth as it needs to be paid by the private sector? And also, in with what degree it will impact the public sector through higher insurance premia. And then a second question I had is so you focused on acute effects of global warming. Do you have any idea of the importance of acute compared to chronic effects?
In terms of the, so I mean, you understood correctly. I mean, I did not go into much technical details during the presentation, but indeed what we're doing is really to start from the distribution of uninsured economic losses. So we started from the global natural disaster database, where you have the total and the insured part. So of course we subtracted whatever had been insured from the total. And then of course we took the maximum of the distribution for each country as percentage of GDP, and this was our evidence of an extreme. And our very strong assumption was that all this impact will be paid in a sense one by one by the public sector. So to really try to have the worst case scenario possible with the data available, but I fully share your concerns in terms of certainly higher uncertainty might mean higher risk premia in terms of insurance, and some insurers also potentially not being fully willing to sometimes also cover the disasters. Once again, on this, certainly we might have to design potentially some sensitivity scenarios. This could be a good idea. We did not do it in this stage, but I guess that if an increasing amount of uncertainty goes on, it could be a very good point to try to play a bit more. But once again, it all depends on the data, because even in terms of when it comes to insurers and the behavior of insurers, most of the global natural disaster databases, some of the most famous, are actually held by reinsurance companies, and they are not willing to share them publicly, which once again hinders our job. And in terms of the chronic versus acute, there's actually a bit of a different methodology on how you account from the two from an economic perspective, because really the effects of global warming, of chronic global warming in a sense, are usually taken into account via the integrated assessment models. Which are these models combining, in a sense, an economic component with a scientific component, trying to come up via a loss damage function on the potential impact in terms of GDP. Now, there are estimates in terms of chronic physical risks that are really wide-ranging, and this it's mostly depending on the fact that the way you define the damage function, quadratic form, exponential form, the way you take into account also the discount factor of certain things does not make it easy, once again, whereas the extreme weather events per se, they have not been tackled by integrated assessment models, and therefore it will be even hard to compare the two in a sense, because really methodologically so far they've been approached in two different ways, and extreme events are actually not been approached at all from a methodological perspective, which again does not help either. But there are several estimates which circulate, and in terms of chronic physical risk, sometimes we speak about sometimes even to 20% of GDP in the very long run. So it really depends on the assumptions that you make.
Okay.
And maybe one small complement on the point of insured versus non-insured losses. That's another extension that could be interesting, but on which we would like to develop, but on which at this stage it's difficult to see when this would gain more traction, is to capture contingent liability risks, basically, because of course, if for the part that is insured, if the frequency and the magnitude of extreme weather events increase, then it's also possible that insurers will be themselves in financial difficulties, and as we've seen in the past for the banking sector, that there will be somehow the need for the public sectors, for the governments to act as lender of last resort or insurer in last resort. So also to cover up for these institutions. So we have approach. I mean, in the Commission there is a research institute, so we have started discussion on this, but it's at a very early stage. But I think this could be also something promising for the future.
Okay. Another interesting subject. Yeah, Renat.
Yes, thank you. I have another question. Up to now, you are doing very exploration work, let's say. The Commission is actually not taking account of climate risk in its actual debt sustainability in the economic governance process, in the semester process. But is there the intention that at a certain point, let's say, for instance, between 5 years, that this will enter the model and will make the exercise of economic governance, certainly for countries like Belgium, with a high debt and high deficits, even more difficult?
Stéphanie, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly.
Investments in climate adaptation, would it be taken into account?
Yeah. So, I mean, so it's true that currently debt sustainability analysis framework doesn't include this neither in the baseline nor in stress tests, this dimension. As we've said, it's exploratory work we did, like it's additional stress tests and information we provide, but it's not reflected. For example, we have, as you probably know, a risk classification that is kind of the outcome of our debt sustainability analysis, and this kind of scenarios is not reflected. So going forward, it could be, I mean, it could be something we could do, but it would need to be done, I would say, together with the member states, because with the proposal that we've put forward, so the Commission's orientation for a new fiscal framework, we have proposed to give a greater role to debt sustainability analysis, and in particular to design this expenditure path. But we also took the commitment that in the future, this any future methodological developments we would discuss with the member states. So I think if we go in this direction, it would have to be based on commonly agreed methodology also, because this work that we did, it was Commission analysis. So I think we would, I mean, we don't, of course, we are not against it per se, because I think it's clear that it's very relevant and it would become more and more relevant, but it would need to be based on, solid methodologies, and a bit like we have, that's why I was referring at the beginning to this work on aging. This is something we would foresee, like it would be a nice model for us to develop a similar working group where we could discuss and build a joint approach with the member states, and once this is done, then we can reflect it in the standard analysis. So I think there are a number of steps that need to be achieved before we can do this, but I think it would totally make sense. And then, of course, as you know, I mean, the proposal is such that we want to create also incentives, of course, for reform investment, including green investment. And this is something that, is an important component of the proposal. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Nobody anymore? No? Okay, then I have to thank you very much for this excellent presentation and question and answers you give. Voilà, we will work on the team also more in the future, and probably there will be some advices also from the Central Economic Council in the next months and years. I think it's always the intention also with the Federal Planning Bureau to try to put something up in Belgium, and perhaps contribute to a working group in European level, as has been with the aging working group in the past. Voilà. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Nice afternoon.
Bye.